This is an NBC News special report. Here is Brian Williams.
And good day. At 2:56 p.m. here in New York, East Coast time, NBC News has confirmed and is adding to the reports of other news agencies at this hour that an incredible journey, an extraordinary life, has apparently come to an end. We are reporting the death of Pope John Paul II at the Vatican. He was 84 years old. This comes at late evening in Rome. Thousands of people have gathered almost spontaneously over the past 2 days. They have been chanting and singing songs. They just heard a public announcement that the Pope was no more. And now you see the initial reaction.
Gloria al Padre, e al Figlio, e allo Spirito Santo.
Nel principio, ora e sempre, nei secoli dei secoli. Amen.
Again, the news is being beamed around the world. First word just circulating now among news agencies. It will rocket through the Vatican and the city of Rome, Catholics around the world.
Il nostro amatissimo Santo Padre Giovanni Paolo II è tornato alla casa del Padre. Preghiamo per lui.
NBC News correspondent Keith Miller is with us from Rome tonight. Keith, who has, of course, covered so much of the papacy of John Paul II. Keith, has it been announced there yet?
Actually, we have seen an announcement via a RAI telecom service and also on a RAI radio station. That's the state-owned television company here. That has not been announced to the general public yet, but it has been certainly circulated. Right now, as we see it from our video monitors, the lights within the papal apartments are lit still, as they have been throughout the day. Of course, we're waiting for an official confirmation from the square. Many of the people down there now, Brian, were there reciting the rosary as they did last night. And I'm not sure that many of them yet know that the Supreme Pontiff has passed away after a 26-year papacy.
And Keith, we're watching the crowd and listening and getting our Italian translation up and running, trying to figure out that very thing as we look at the faces of the pilgrims who have come to the city. And reading from the Reuters news agency, just as the confirmations start coming in, Pope John Paul II died on Saturday. The Vatican has announced the 84-year-old pontiff, who had headed the Roman Catholic Church for 26 years, died at 9:37 p.m. So that would be 2:37 p.m. Eastern Time, according to a statement. Here is this from Associated Press. Pope John Paul II, the Polish pontiff who led the Roman Catholic Church for more than a quarter century and became history's most traveled pope, has died at 84. The Vatican announced in an email to news agencies on Saturday. So we have here the possibility of this gathering of thousands of people in St. Peter's Square may very well be learning along with us of the death of the Pope. Our NBC News chief science correspondent, Robert Bazell, with us in our studios in New York, has obviously been tracking, as we have, on a round-the-clock basis, the medical developments. Bob, the last bulletin today was that while the Pope was able to speak to and recognize his closest associates, his fever had spiked once again. There were reports overnight of significant organ failure, and apparently his 84-year-old body, suffering the effects of Parkinson's, was unable to hang on.
Indeed, Brian, he put up an enormous fight, which was typical of the way John Paul fought all of his medical challenges over his many years of his life. But we've seen a man die with peace and dignity in the way many people around the world die these days who get appropriate medical care, which is that they survive into their 80s or sometimes longer, but infection ultimately becomes too much when they have an underlying condition such as Parkinson's disease. He had what's called septic shock, spread through his body, causing massive organ failure. He, by all means, every indication was it was a peaceful death. This morning there was a fever which was probably due to pneumonia from a fluid building up in his lungs. It was the end. He was moving toward the end. We know he was told he was moving toward the end. He elected not to go to the hospital, not to have heroic measures such as a respirator, which would have been available in an apartment, which were not available in the Vatican. But he was attended by a staff of physicians. But it was ultimately the Parkinson's disease, after more than a decade, that was his undoing, because what was a urinary tract infection that could have been treated easily in most people became too much, and it ultimately just destroyed his very weak body.
Robert Pizzell, who'll be watching along with us and has been here in our New York studios, thanks. And we have confirmed that just in the moments we've been on the air, something we heard from the stage was translated into English. The Holy Father has returned to the house of the Father. That indeed what the crowd has been told tonight. Now, we should also point out that a series of speakers have used some very final terminology in addressing this crowd. Last night, the mourners were all told that this would be the night Christ opened the door to the Pope. Many papers in the capital city of Rome people woke up to a front page treatment of the end of the life of the Pope. Many of them found it to be a matter of something academic, as they told our producers and reporters this morning, that it was a matter of time. Indeed, much of the world awoke to check on the Pope's status. NBC News Washington Bureau Chief, moderator of Meet the Press, Tim Russert, who's had, of course, so many dealings with the Pope, as we've all chronicled this astonishing life of 26 years over the years in our business. Tim, your thoughts at this hour?
Brian, this man of history is dead, but this man of faith now has another life. It was so interesting to watch the Pope deal with death. Last night he issued a statement saying, "I am happy and you should be happy too. I have entrusted everything in the Virgin Mary." It is the ultimate test of one's faith when you're on your deathbed, because everything comes into focus as to what your beliefs are. Is there an afterlife? Is there a heavenly reward? This Pope believed that very, very deeply, and he now has entered it. As a man of history, Pope John Paul II, very controversial, firm belief in his ideas and his positions on every possible issue imaginable, from war and peace to sexuality. He believed that there was an intellectual and moral consistency. Many of those views were rejected by the majority of American Catholics, and yet he adhered to them and continued to teach them. It is going to be quite interesting to see who succeeds Pope John Paul II. The Church is in a very interesting period now, as it continues to gain members in Africa and the Third World, but lose members in Europe and other more traditional areas of the Catholic faith. And what will it mean for the decline of priests, particularly here in the United States, a religion that is based on the ministering of sacraments like matrimony and communion and the last rites, needs priests, and there's a very acute shortage. But all that in its totality, I think, underscores just what this Pope has meant to his flock. Even if they disagreed with him on issues, they revered and loved him as a person and as the Vicar of Christ.
Tim, we have a moment, and I think it's appropriate to ask for your favorite moment in the company of the Pope.
Brian, it obviously involves my son in such a powerful moment. When we went to Rome in Easter week of 1985, an extraordinary week, historic week, the first time an American television network broadcast from the Vatican. People wouldn't talk to us until the Holy Father said, "I will celebrate a private mass for NBC," as he would say. He would met with Brian Gumbel and Jane Pauley and offered them greetings and exchanged in conversation. My wife was pregnant. He said, "When your baby is born, come back to Rome. Come back to the Vatican. I will bless your baby." And we stood there, and Luke had a T-shirt which said "Totus Tuus" in Latin, which means all yours. It's the Pope's motto. After he was shot, he said, "If I live, totus tuus, I will I am all yours to the Blessed Virgin. He saw my son, picked him up, hugged him, kissed him on the forehead, patted his cheeks, saying, very nice, very nice. It is a blessing and a memory that will last forever. As a journalist, we have to cover the Pope and the Church and its positions on issues and the crises and difficulties it encounters in a fair and objective way. But as a Catholic, that private and personal moment, that blessing of my son, is seared in my mind and heart forever.
That's very easy to understand. Tim, thank you for that. We're also joined by the Pope's biographer, the author and NBC News Vatican expert, George Weigel, who has been here with us in our NBC studios for the better part of 24 hours, watching all of this, waiting for the moment we all knew was coming, which again has arrived just a few moments ago this afternoon at apparently 37 minutes past the hour, 2:37 p.m. Eastern Time. It's quite late in the evening now in Rome as you see the rosary being said in St. Peter's Square. George, I have to, as someone who has come to know this towering figure in history, I must ask your initial feelings at this hour.
I think, like many millions of people around the world, Brian, I'm feeling a little orphaned right now. And yet, in the midst of that sorrow, there's a profound sense of the rightness of the timing of this. Throughout the Catholic world, tomorrow is Divine Mercy Sunday. This is a devotion that began in Poland, that the Holy Father promoted, that he offered to the entire church around the world as a way to think about the face of God at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of a new millennium. The mercy of God turned towards humanity. That he should die on this day is a remarkable providential moment, it seems to me.
And how does that fit with so many other moments in his life?
This is a life of extraordinary drama from beginning to end. You couldn't make this up if you were writing a script in Hollywood. But what has connected this life, it seems to me, is his intense conviction that following the will of God, as one discerns it, is the path to genuine human liberation. This was, in a sense, the freest man in the world, even in his physical suffering, even in his debility in recent years. This was a free man, and he was free because of his faith and hope in Christ.
George, what is happening right now? We are concentrating a lot of the camera angles on those three lights, the papal suite of apartments on the top floor. What happens? What's the chain of events now that word has been announced that the Pope has passed?
I assume by this time the officials responsible, Cardinal Sodano, the Secretary of State, whom we saw a moment ago, Cardinal Martinez Somalo, the Camerlengo or Chamberlain, who runs the affairs of the Church during the interregnum, Cardinal Ratzinger, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, have certified the Pope's death, which has also been certified by his doctor. They will put in train a series of communications telling the cardinals around the world and telling heads of state what in fact they already know, namely that the Pope has died. And I believe that they will prepare the Pope's body for exposition in St. Peter's for the veneration of the faithful and their prayer for him. This has to be a moment of intense pain, in particular for the Pope's longtime secretary, Archbishop Stanisław Dziwisz, who has been with him since 1967, who has given his entire life to making someone else's life work. But Dziwisz is himself a man of profound faith. And I think, as Archbishop Sandri said, the sense is the Holy Father has been called to the home of the Father, and there's a great satisfaction in that. He is now where he has always wanted to be.
There are some of the quirks of Vatican history, some folklore, some fact. Run through them. The calling of the birth name 3 times, the destruction of the ring and seal of the office of Pope, the closing of the doors as we look at St. Peter's, the bronze doors. What are they?
The breaking of the Pope's ring is in fact a legal matter. That's the fisherman's ring, as it's referred to. It seals all major papal documents, the appointment of bishops, letters to heads of state, etc. The breaking of the ring ensures that no one can send anything out in the Pope's name now that the Pope has gone home to God. The calling of the Pope's name 3 times after the moment of his death is in fact a more humane way of certifying his death. The tradition used to be that they would take a small silver mallet and tap the deceased Pope on the forehead 3 times, much as in other cultures people would hold a feather under someone's nose. Now they simply call his name, Carol, Carol, Carol. Charles, no answer, he's gone. The papal apartment will be sealed after the funeral. This is an innovation. The Pope decreed in 1996 in the Apostolic Constitution that will govern events over the next month that those who are accustomed to living in the apartment, Archbishop Dziwisz, his secretary, Monsignor Mokritsky, the second secretary, the Polish sisters who looked after him, may stay there until the Pope's funeral. Then the apartment will be sealed, literally sealed with lead seals, until the election of the next Pope.
We are looking at the crowd. You were listening to the Italian address to the crowd, and we're seeing, of course, we've seen tears among the pilgrims for several days now, but we believe that all those gathered have now heard firsthand that the Pope is no more.
And how appropriately that after Archbishop Sandri, the number 2 and the Secretary of State, read the announcement, the Holy Father has been called to the home of the Father, that the first thing that was done was to sing the ancient Marian hymn, Salve Regina, Hail Holy Queen. This was a Pope of intense Marian piety. Tim Russert mentioned the Totus Tuus. That was John Paul II's dedication to the Mother of God. Entirely appropriate that they should sing Salve Regina at the end.
I've been told the flag of the United States has been lowered atop the White House. NBC News White House correspondent David Gregory is with us. And David, what might we expect from the President in the next hours and days?
Well, to start, Brian, I think you'll hear from the President in due course here today. He was certainly prepared to make his thoughts and prayers known to the world after the passing of Pope John Paul II. He met with the Pontiff on 3 separate occasions in his presidency, and it was certainly poignant for him. I remember being there in Rome in 2001. It was in July. The big issue in the United States was the debate over stem cell research, which the President reached a compromise on later that summer. And he heard very sharply from John Paul on this issue that he felt it was wrong to allow that kind of research to go through it. But what struck me was the personal reaction that the President had at that time, still early on in his presidency before 9/11. He described the experience as simply awesome to be in his presence. He looked in some ways very rigid that day in the presence of the Pope. The First Lady was there, and he brought one of his twin daughters, Barbara, along as well to meet the Pope personally. So he described it as a moving experience, and their relationship evolved. They had substantive discussions and even debates over Iraq and even the fate of the Catholic Church and the church abuse scandal in subsequent meetings, Brian.
David Gregory at the White House, and we will continue to check in with him. As David mentioned, we can expect some remarks from the President of the United States. He has been asked to be kept abreast of every development, as you might imagine. White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card has been the point person and the point of contact. Here are the Vatican bells, another traditional sign that the Pope has passed away. We'll listen for a moment. There are massive gatherings of Catholic worshipers around the planet, and one that we've been watching particularly closely in no small way because it, of course, is in great close proximity to where we are here in New York. A gathering of Catholic worshipers at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where we might add, because of the nature of the rumors and reports about the Pope's failing health, it was erroneously announced yesterday from the pulpit that he had passed away. Today, I have been told in the last few minutes, 60,000 people in St. Peter's Square, but also people in St. Patrick's in New York are starting to learn this terrible news. NBC News correspondent Peter Alexander is there. And Peter, while we continue to watch St. Peter's Square, what can you tell us about St. Pat's?
Brian, right now we are starting to see people file into the cathedral here. It is really a centerpiece of American Catholicism. More than 64 million American Catholics throughout this country, almost a quarter of the population. Many of them were here for the scheduled masses today that occurred first at 8 o'clock and a second one at noon. We are told that the Archbishop of New York, Edward Cardinal Egan, will speak a little bit later at this evening's scheduled mass. That is scheduled to occur at about 5:30 tonight. I was inside within the last hour or so, and some of the notes were written in the guest book there that said the following words. One woman wrote, "God bless the Pope and take her to heaven peacefully." Another man wrote, "May you rest in the arms of the Lord, Pope John Paul II." There's a great affinity that many of the people across New York and Americans across this country have for this Pope. The Pontiff having visited the United States 7 times, more than any other Pope before him. One of the most recent visits was in 1995, just less than a mile north of where we are standing, turning lawns of Central Park into an outdoor cathedral. More than 125 people were there that day. As it has been said by our colleagues, Tom Brokaw articulated it before, that it almost had the atmosphere of the reception for a rock star when he was here. And as people are learning about the words from us, we are watching them begin to file inside of the church right now. Brian.
Peter Alexander at St. Pat's in New York, not far from here. We continue to look at St. Peter's Square, the now familiar three lights of the papal apartment. The crowd, I imagine, while already near capacity of several thousand, again, one estimate here has it at 60,000 in the center of Rome. Let's listen. George Weigel, put your best Italian to work here and tell us what's being said.
Accolto nella casa del Padre.
He's been called home to the house of the Father, heard the call.
Lo pensiamo vicino al Signore Gesù, risorto e vivente.
Died in the peace
Ancora una
of
volta
Christ, risen,
ci facciamo aiutare dalla Vergine Maria.
giving himself into the hands of the
This
Blessed
is the
Virgin.
interpreter. Am I ready? Yeah, there's a priest saying a prayer right now in St.
All right,
Peter's Square.
that voice you heard first was papal biographer George Weigel, and apparently the voice in English you're also hearing just under that is our Italian to English interpreter getting ready to broadcast. We'll wait until he is set. George, we're learning details about the mechanism that happened, the email that went out, and talk about the electronic age. When this Pope came to be Pope, there was no internet, there were no pagers, cell phones. It says that the email advisory said that, as John Paul wrote in 1996, all procedures for handling his death have been put into motion. A mass is scheduled for St. Peter's Square tomorrow morning. Now, George, there'll be so many events happening, and this in the next 4 to 6 days will culminate with his funeral and then the break before the conclave. What will the mass be tomorrow morning?
It will be the Mass of the Octave of Easter, the 1 week after Easter, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, John Paul II has designated as Divine Mercy Sunday. It's entirely predictable, I think, that connection will be drawn, that this man went home to God on a day that he had specially dedicated to the mercy of God, turned to the third millennium of modern human history.
The statement, by the way, there's been so much talk about the Pope's vital organs failing. Died, it says, after suffering heart and kidney failure following 2 hospitalizations in as many months. John Paul led the Roman Catholic Church for more than a quarter century, it goes on to say. He was, as you know, a history maker from the moment his name was announced. The first time there had been a non-Italian pope in somewhere around 500 years. The history began with his first day as pope. It has ended. This extraordinary life, this extraordinary journey, this afternoon.